There was a moment after the Oklahoma City Thunder demolished the Milwaukee Bucks that Giannis Antetokounmpo said something that made every front office in the league pay attention. What had finally broken inside the organization? After Milwaukee was smashed 122-102 by the Thunder on January 22nd, Antetokounmpo delivered a post-game message that felt less like typical frustration and more like a public breaking point. "We're not playing hard," he said. "We're not playing to win. We're not playing together. Our chemistry isn't there. Guys are being selfish. We just don't get it, and we don't have enough time." The Bucks had fallen to 18 wins and 25 losses, sitting outside the playoff picture entirely. It wasn't clear exactly who Antetokounmpo was referring to, or whether this represented a blanket statement by the former league MVP. But the comments certainly weren't what the team wanted to hear, given he has flirted with the idea of demanding a trade multiple times over the past year. For a franchise already navigating trade deadline pressure with just 2 weeks remaining until February 5th, their franchise player publicly calling teammates selfish represented either a desperate attempt to provoke change or the final warning before an irreversible fracture. And according to sources close to the situation, the internal aftermath of Antetokounmpo's comments reveals an organization at a genuine crossroads. People familiar with the matter say the locker room atmosphere immediately following the Thunder loss was extraordinarily tense even before Antetokounmpo spoke to the media. According to those briefed on the post-game environment, there had been visible frustration during the game itself, body language suggesting disconnection, plays where effort appeared inconsistent, defensive rotations that broke down not from scheme failure but from what some perceived as lack of commitment. Sources say the 122-102 final score reflected more than just talent disparity. It represented, to some within the organization, a team that had stopped fighting. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the team, is that Antetokounmpo's public comments were an impulsive reaction spoken in the heat of immediate frustration. Sources say he had been building toward this moment for days, that the Thunder loss simply provided the catalyst for voicing concerns he'd been processing privately. People familiar with his mindset during this period describe someone who felt he tried leadership through private channels, team meetings, individual conversations, leading by example, and concluded that public accountability represented the only remaining lever he hadn't pulled. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the situation, Antetokounmpo's use of the word selfish reportedly referred to specific observable patterns rather than vague criticism. Sources say he'd identified repeated sequences where teammates prioritized individual shot attempts over team execution, where defensive rotations failed because players weren't committed to helping one another, where the connective tissue of team basketball had dissolved into isolation-heavy possessions. People familiar with his thinking describe this as frustration rooted in tactical observation rather than personal attack. The "we don't have enough time" portion of his comments, according to sources close to the organization, carried particular weight given the proximity to the trade deadline. People familiar with how those words resonated internally say they were interpreted multiple ways. Some heard it as urgency about salvaging the current season. Others understood it as commentary about his own timeline with the franchise. Still, others viewed it as acknowledgement that the February 5th deadline represented a point of no return for organizational direction. What made Antetokounmpo's public criticism particularly significant, according to those briefed on the matter, was the context of his previous trade flirtations. Sources say his comments about teammates being selfish immediately triggered speculation about whether this represented him creating public justification for an eventual trade request, or whether it was genuinely an attempt to shock the team into better performance. People familiar with league-wide discussions describe rival executives immediately parsing his language for signals about his intentions. Behind the scenes in Milwaukee's front office, According to people close to the organization, Antetokounmpo's post-game comments created immediate emergency discussions. Sources say leadership convened quickly to assess whether this represented a manageable crisis or a fundamental breaking point. People familiar with these urgent conversations describe debates about whether the front office needed to accelerate trade deadline plans, whether coaching changes should be considered, or whether the situation required direct intervention from ownership to reset team dynamics. The coaching staff's position, according to those briefed on their thinking, was reportedly complex. Sources say head coach Doc Rivers understood Antetokounmpo's frustration and privately agreed with some of the substance, that effort and connectivity had been inconsistent, that certain players had prioritized individual statistics over team success. But people familiar with the coach's perspective say there was also concern that public criticism from the franchise player could fracture locker room cohesion even further, potentially making the problems worse rather than provoking positive change. What hasn't been discussed publicly, according to sources close to the team, is how other players reacted to Antetokounmpo's comments. People familiar with locker room dynamics in the immediate aftermath describe a range of responses. Some players reportedly felt the criticism was justified and accepted accountability. Others bristled at being called selfish publicly. Still others seemed uncertain whether Antetokounmpo's message applied to them specifically or represented broader team assessment. Sources say this created additional tension as players processed whether they'd been individually targeted. According to those briefed on the matter, the 18-25 record heading into the trade deadline created a particularly challenging context for Antetokounmpo's criticism. Sources say the team's positioning outside the playoff picture entirely, not even in play-in range, meant that incremental improvement wouldn't satisfy championship expectations. People familiar with internal evaluations describe this as a situation where the gap between current reality and acceptable outcomes felt insurmountable without dramatic change. Behind the scenes, according to people close to the organization, the front office's limited assets to improve the roster made Antetokounmpo's public pressure particularly difficult to address. Sources say leadership understood that simply acknowledging his concerns wouldn't satisfy him, that he'd expect tangible roster improvement. But people familiar with Milwaukee's trade position describe an organization with minimal draft capital and few tradable contracts that could command meaningful upgrades. This gap between expectation and capability, sources say, created genuine anxiety within the front office. What complicated the situation further, according to those briefed on league-wide discussions, was how rival teams interpreted Antetokounmpo's comments. Sources say several front offices viewed the public criticism as potentially accelerating his departure timeline, the calling teammates selfish while saying, "We don't have enough time," suggested someone approaching the end of his patience. People familiar with these external evaluations describe teams beginning to position themselves in case Milwaukee's situation deteriorated to the point where trading Antetokounmpo became necessary. The specific chemistry concerns Antetokounmpo referenced, according to people close to the team, reportedly stemmed from observable patterns throughout the season. Sources say there had been recurring issues with defensive communication, offensive sets breaking down into isolation basketball, and what some within the organization viewed as players protecting individual statistics rather than sacrificing for winning. People familiar with film sessions describe coaching staff identifying these patterns but struggling to correct them through scheme or rotation adjustments. What made the timing particularly significant, according to those briefed on the situation, was that Antetokounmpo delivered this criticism with the trade deadline just 2 weeks away. Sources say this created enormous pressure on the front office to demonstrate responsiveness, that waiting until after the deadline to address his concerns would likely be interpreted as organizational indifference. People familiar with the Strategic calculus described this as Milwaukee having a compressed timeline to either make meaningful roster moves or risk Antetokounmpo's frustration escalating into formal trade demands. Behind the scenes, according to people close to the organization, there were reportedly discussions about whether Antetokounmpo's comments represented coordinated strategy with his representation or purely individual expression. Sources say some within the front office wondered if this was designed to create public pressure that would force ownership to be more aggressive at the deadline, essentially using media attention as leverage for organizational action. People familiar with these internal theories described them as uncertain speculation rather than confirmed understanding of Antetokounmpo's motivations. The ownership group's response, according to those briefed on their thinking, reportedly emphasized the need for immediate action to address both the roster deficiencies and the team chemistry issues Antetokounmpo had identified. Sources say ownership conveyed willingness to absorb financial costs if it meant demonstrating commitment to their franchise player. But people familiar with these directives acknowledge that willingness to spend doesn't solve the fundamental problem of having limited assets to offer in trades. What remained unclear in the days following Antetokounmpo's comments, according to people close to the situation, was whether his public criticism would actually produce the change he was seeking. Sources say there was genuine uncertainty within the organization about whether teammates would respond with improved effort and connectivity, or whether the public nature of the criticism had damaged relationships beyond repair. People familiar with these concerns describe them as recognizing that Antetokounmpo had deployed a high-risk strategy. It might provoke positive change, or it might accelerate team dissolution, league-wide, according to sources familiar with broader NBA discussions. Antetokounmpo's comments became immediate fodder for trade deadline speculation. People briefed on conversations among rival executives say several teams began preparing contingency scenarios in case Milwaukee's situation deteriorated further. Though most acknowledged that the Bucks remained unlikely to trade their franchise player, sources describe this as the league hedging against an unlikely, but potentially seismic, development. The guys are being selfish phrasing, according to those close to the team, reportedly resonated particularly strongly because it suggested individual agendas conflicting with collective goals. Sources say this framing aligned with what some within the organization had observed but been reluctant to state publicly, that certain players prioritized their own opportunities over team success. People familiar with internal assessments describe Antetokounmpo's willingness to say this publicly as either brave accountability or potentially destructive truth-telling, depending on perspective. As the February 5th trade deadline approached, the question facing Milwaukee transformed from whether they could improve the roster to whether they could salvage the locker room chemistry that their franchise player had publicly declared broken. For the Bucks, Antetokounmpo's comments represented a defining moment, either the wake-up call that provoked necessary change, or the public fracture that made their already difficult season irretrievable. Inside the organization, sources say, no one knew with certainty which outcome would materialize. What everyone understood was that time had run out for gradual solutions.
If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video. It helps this story reach more basketball fans who care about what happens beyond the box score. For more NBA stories inspired by real news, told with depth, context, and realism, subscribe to Beyond the Hardwood. And if you want to be here when the next chapter unfolds, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Let us know what you think in the comments. Was this the right move, or is there more beneath the surface? Until next time, this is Beyond the Hardwood.